Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we wander through candle-lit corridors of memory to find where our Halloween monsters were born. Settle in, rest your eyes, and let the quiet history carry you. In the gathering dusk of ancient October nights, when the last harvest fires flickered against the darkness and the first frost touched the stubble fields with silver, our ancestors understood something we have nearly forgotten. They knew that the world was thin in places, transparent as morning mist, and that on certain nights the boundary between what is and what might be became as fragile as autumn leaves. These were the nights when monsters were born, not from imagination alone, but from the deep wells of human experience, from our attempts to understand the mysteries that surrounded us like shadows around a candle flame. The story of Halloween monsters begins not in Hollywood studios or Victorian drawing rooms, but in the wind-swept hills of ancient Ireland, where the Celtic people marked the turning of the seasons with ceremonies older than memory. They called this time Samhain, pronouncing it Samhain with the soft cadence of Gaelic tongues, and they understood it to be the night when summer died and winter was born, when the cattle were brought down from the high pastures, and the grain was safely stored against the coming cold. But Samhain was more than an agricultural festival. It was the night when the veil between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew gossamer thin, when spirits could cross between worlds as easily as stepping from one room to another. The Celts did not fear this thinning exactly, but they respected it with the profound wisdom of people who lived close to the earth and understood that some forces were beyond human control. They built great bonfires on hilltops, sending columns of orange flame and smoke into the star-scattered sky, creating beacons that could be seen for miles across the darkened countryside. These fires served multiple purposes, each layer of meaning adding depth to the ritual. They were practical fires, providing warmth and light during the long autumn night. There were sacrificial fires, where offerings were made to ensure the favor of the gods and the return of spring. They were protective fires, their light serving as a barrier against malevolent spirits that might seek to harm the living. And they were community fires, gathering places where neighbors came together to share food and stories, strengthening the bonds that would see them through the dark months ahead. Picture those ancient hills on Samhain night, dotted with points of light like fallen stars, each fire surrounded by figures moving in the golden glow, their faces painted with shadows and flame. The air would be sharp with the scent of burning wood and the lingering sweetness of apples, for this was also the time of the apple harvest, when orchards heavy with fruit offered their bounty to be stored in root cellars and pressed into cider that would sustain families through winter's grip. The Celtic understanding of death was complex and layered, reflecting a world view in which the departed did not simply vanish, but continued to exist in a parallel realm that occasionally intersected with the world of the living. On Samhain night, these intersections became numerous and unpredictable. Ancestors might return to visit their former homes, seeking warmth at familiar hearths or guidance for their descendants. Other spirits, less benevolent, might also cross over, bringing confusion, mischief, or worse to the unwary. To protect themselves, the Celts developed elaborate customs and rituals. They carved faces into turnips and gourds, creating jack-o'-lanterns whose flickering candles were meant to frighten away harmful spirits. They dressed in costumes, usually simple affairs, made from animal skins and masks, both to disguise themselves from malevolent entities and to honor the spirits of the animals that had provided for them throughout the year. They left food offerings outside their doors, plates of bread and milk and honey that might appease hungry ghosts or satisfy wandering spirits. But perhaps most importantly, they gathered together, understanding that community was the strongest protection against the unknown. In great halls warmed by central fires, they told stories through the long night, tales that had been passed down through generations, each telling adding new details while preserving the essential truths that helped them make sense of a world filled with mystery and wonder. These stories were the seeds from which our Halloween monsters would eventually grow. They spoke of shapeshifters who could take the form of wolves or ravens, of wise women who knew the secret properties of herbs and could speak to spirits, of the restless dead who refused to stay quietly in their graves, of beings from the other world who were neither wholly good nor entirely evil, but possessed of their own alien logic and desires. The storytellers who preserved these tales understood their function wasn't merely to entertain, but to educate, to prepare their listeners for encounters with forces beyond ordinary human experience. They knew that fear, properly channeled, could be a teacher as valuable as any priest or scholar, helping people navigate the dangerous passages between seasons, between life and death, between the known and the unknowable. As the Roman Empire expanded across Europe, Celtic traditions encountered classical mythology and Roman administrative efficiency. The Romans, being practical people, were less interested in eradicating local customs than in adapting them to serve imperial purposes. They merged Samhain with their own festival of Pomona, the goddess of fruits and gardens, which is why apples remain associated with Halloween to this day. They systematized the calendar, fixing the date of the festival and creating the kind of organized observance that could be managed across vast territories. But the real transformation came with the arrival of Christianity, which brought not conquest, but conversion, seeking not to destroy pagan traditions, but to redirect them toward Christian purposes. The Church established All Saints' Day on November 1st, creating a Christian alternative to Samhain that honored the saints and martyrs who had died in service to the faith. The night before became All Hallows' Eve, from which we derive the word Halloween, and many of the old customs were preserved but given new meanings. The bonfires that had once been lit to honor pagan gods were now kindled to celebrate Christian saints. The food offerings that had been left for wandering spirits were now blessed and shared with the poor and hungry. The stories that had once taught about encounters with otherworldly beings were now framed as tales of divine intervention and spiritual warfare between good and evil. Yet something of the original mystery persisted. Christianity, particularly in its medieval form, was itself rich with supernatural elements, and the boundary between Christian miracle and pagan magic was often fluid and uncertain. Saints performed wonders that seemed magical to ordinary believers, while demons and devils provided explanations for misfortune and evil that echoed older beliefs about malevolent spirits. The thin places that the Celts had recognized on Samhain night remained thin, but now they were populated by Christian entities rather than pagan ones. As these traditions spread across Europe and evolved through centuries of practice, they began to accumulate the specific monsters that would eventually become Halloween staples. Each culture added its own fears and obsessions, its own attempts to explain phenomena that defied rational understanding. The wise women of Celtic tradition became the witches of medieval Christianity. The shapeshifters of pagan folklore became the werewolves of Christian demonology. The restless dead of ancient belief became the ghosts and vampires of later centuries. The process was gradual and organic, like the slow transformation of autumn leaves from green to gold to brown. Each generation inherited the stories of their ancestors, but adapted them to reflect their own experiences and concerns. A tale that began as an explanation for why milk sometimes spoiled might evolve into a story about supernatural creatures that threatened livestock. A legend that originally helped explain the changing seasons might transform into a cautionary tale about the dangers of venturing out alone on dark nights. By the medieval period, the landscape of European folklore was rich with creatures that would eventually find their way into Halloween celebrations. Witches gathered on mountaintops to dance with the devil. Vampires stalked the night in search of blood. Werewolves howled in the darkness of enchanted forests. Ghosts walked the corridors of castles and manor houses, seeking either rest or revenge. Demons tempted the faithful with offers of worldly power and pleasure. These monsters served important psychological and social functions in medieval society. They provided explanations for natural phenomena that science could not yet understand. They offered outlets for fears and anxieties that had no other acceptable expression. They reinforced social norms by showing the consequences of straying from accepted behavior. They created opportunities for communities to come together in shared rituals of protection and celebration. Most importantly, they preserved something essential about the human experience of living in a world that contained far more mystery than certainty, far more questions than answers. The monsters of medieval folklore were not simply creatures to be feared, but teachers who helped people understand their place in a cosmos that was vast, complex, and often incomprehensible. As we drift through these ancient landscapes of memory and imagination, feeling the warmth of long-dead fires and hearing the whisper of stories told in languages forgotten, we begin to understand that our Halloween monsters were never just figments of fancy. They were attempts to give form to formless fears, to create names for nameless anxieties, to build bridges between the world as it appeared to be, and the world as it actually was, with all its hidden depths and secret corridors. The night grows deeper around us, and the ancient fires burn lower, but their light continues to illuminate the path that leads from those first October ceremonies to our modern celebration of Halloween. The monsters are stirring in the shadows of memory, preparing to take the shapes that will make them familiar to us, preparing to teach us what they taught our ancestors about the beautiful terror of being human in a world where anything might be possible and often is. In village squares across medieval Europe, when the harvest moon hung low and amber in the October sky, people began to whisper about the women who lived at the edges of their communities. These were the wise women, the midwives, the healers, who knew which herbs could ease a fever and which could bring a peaceful death to those beyond saving. They lived in cottages that smelled of drying plants and simmering broths, their windows glowing soft and yellow in the darkness, like the eyes of friendly spirits. These women occupied a complex place in medieval society, both necessary and suspect, revered and feared. They were the ones called when a child struggled to be born, when a wound refused to heal, when mysterious ailments struck down the strong and healthy. Their knowledge was ancient and empirical, passed down through generations of women who had learned to read the subtle language of the body and the precise grammar of growing things. In their gardens grew foxglove and hemlock, lavender and nightshade, herbs that could heal or harm, depending on the skill of the practitioner and the need of the patient. They knew when to gather mushrooms by moonlight and how to preserve the potency of roots through the long winter months. They understood the cycles of the human body as intimately as they understood the cycles of the seasons, and they could often predict when life was beginning and when it was drawing to its natural close. But knowledge, especially knowledge held by women in a patriarchal society, was always dangerous. The same skills that made these women valuable to their communities also made them suspect when things went wrong. If a charm brought healing, it might also bring curse. If herbs could ease pain, they might also cause it. If a wise woman could help with birth, she might also cause miscarriage or stillbirth. The line between beneficial magic and harmful witchcraft was often determined not by the nature of the practice, but by its outcome and the social position of the practitioner. The transformation of wise women into wicked witches was a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries, influenced by changing religious beliefs, social tensions, and political pressures. The early Christian church had generally been tolerant of folk healing practices, recognizing them as part of God's provision for human need. Many saints were associated with healing miracles, and the boundary between divine intervention and natural remedy was often blurred. But as Christianity became more systematized and hierarchical, church authorities became increasingly suspicious of practices that seemed to bypass official religious channels. Healing that depended on knowledge of herbs rather than prayer to saints, that relied on the skill of individuals rather than the mediation of priests, that was associated primarily with women rather than male clergy, began to seem potentially heretical. The process accelerated during the medieval period, when a series of natural disasters, social upheavals, and religious conflicts created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion throughout Europe. The Black Death, which killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, left survivors desperate for explanations and someone to blame. Crop failures, unusual weather patterns, and economic disruption all contributed to a sense that the natural order was under assault by supernatural forces. In this atmosphere of anxiety and uncertainty, the figure of the witch emerged as a focal point for communal fears. She was no longer the wise woman who might help with a difficult birth or a persistent cough, but a malevolent figure who had made a pact with the devil in exchange for supernatural powers. She could curse livestock, spoil crops, cause illness and death, and seduce innocent souls into damnation. She flew through the night on broomsticks or demons, attended Sabbaths where she worshipped Satan, and plotted against Christian communities. The witch as we recognize her today, with her pointed hat and black robes, her broomstick and black cat, her cauldron of bubbling potions, emerged from this complex historical process. Each element of her appearance carried symbolic meaning that reflected medieval fears and anxieties. The pointed hat, similar to those worn by Jews and other marginalized groups, marked her as an outsider. The black robes suggested her alliance with dark forces. The broomstick, a symbol of domestic labor, transformed into an instrument of supernatural flight, represented the inversion of proper social order. The black cat that became her constant companion was particularly significant. Cats, especially black ones, were associated with the devil in medieval Christian thought, and their nocturnal habits and silent movement made them seem mysterious and potentially threatening. The fact that cats were often kept by women living alone, particularly older women who might be herbalists or midwives, strengthened the association between felines and witchcraft. The cauldron, too, carried layers of meaning. It was a practical tool for cooking and for preparing herbal remedies, but in the context of witchcraft, it became a vessel for brewing evil potions and communicating with supernatural forces. The image of the witch stirring her cauldron while muttering incantations combined the familiar domestic activity of cooking with the frightening possibility of magical transformation. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the witch's transformation was her relationship to Halloween and the autumn season. The old Celtic traditions that had celebrated the thinning of the veil between worlds were reinterpreted through Christian theology as times when evil forces were particularly active. The wise woman who had once been honored for her ability to navigate these dangerous liminal periods became the witch who was feared for her alliance with the dark powers that emerged during them. The witch hunts that began in the late medieval period and continued into the early modern era represented one of the darkest chapters in European and American history. Thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft and executed, often after enduring torture that forced them to confess to impossible crimes. The trials in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692 and 1693 marked the culmination of this hysteria in the New World, where 20 people were executed and many more imprisoned on charges of practicing witchcraft. Yet even during the height of the witch trials, something of the older tradition persisted. People continued to seek out folk healers and wise women, though they were more careful about how they described these encounters. Herbal knowledge continued to be passed down, though often in secret or disguised as ordinary household management. The understanding that some individuals possessed special knowledge about the natural world and its hidden properties never entirely disappeared, though it went underground during periods of persecution. As the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment gradually changed European attitudes toward supernatural phenomena, the witch began her transformation from feared reality to literary character. Writers like Goethe and Shakespeare found in witches powerful dramatic figures who could embody themes of knowledge and power, temptation and corruption, the natural and the supernatural. The witch of literature was often more complex and sympathetic than the witch of medieval demonology, sometimes representing wisdom traditions that had been suppressed or marginalized by patriarchal society. By the 19th century, as Halloween began to evolve into its modern form, the witch had become one of its central figures. But she was no longer the terrifying agent of Satan that had haunted medieval nightmares. Instead, she was becoming a more ambiguous figure, sometimes frightening, but often merely mysterious, sometimes evil, but increasingly often simply powerful in ways that conventional society did not understand or approve. The witch costumes that began appearing at Halloween parties in the late 1800s and early 1900s reflected this transformation. Children and adults dressed as witches were playing with images of power and mystery rather than genuinely invoking supernatural forces. The pointed hat and broomstick had become symbols in a symbolic game, elements in a ritual of play acting that allowed people to explore themes of magic and transformation in a safe, controlled environment. This domestication of the witch reflected broader changes in American and European society. As scientific understanding advanced and religious explanations for natural phenomena became less necessary, supernatural beliefs began to migrate from the realm of serious consideration to the realm of entertainment. The witch, who had once been a genuine threat to social order, became a figure of fun, a character in a costume drama that people could enjoy precisely because they no longer believed in her power. Yet something essential persisted even in this transformation. The witch continued to represent knowledge that lay outside conventional channels, power that was not subject to ordinary social controls, connection to natural forces that civilization sought to tame or control. She embodied the possibility that there were other ways of understanding the world, other sources of wisdom than those recognized by official authorities. In our modern Halloween celebrations, the witch serves multiple functions. For children, she provides a safe way to explore themes of power and transformation, to imagine what it might be like to possess supernatural abilities. For adults, she offers a nostalgic connection to older ways of understanding the relationship between human beings and the natural world. For communities, she serves as a shared symbol that connects contemporary celebrations to centuries of folklore and tradition. As we watch the witch stirring her cauldron in countless Halloween decorations, as we see children donning pointed hats and carrying toy broomsticks, we are witnessing the latest chapter in a story that began with wise women gathering herbs by moonlight in medieval gardens. The witch has traveled a long and complex path from healer to heretic to Halloween icon. But something of her original meaning continues to resonate. She reminds us that knowledge comes in many forms, that power can manifest in unexpected ways, that the boundary between the natural and the supernatural is not as clear and fixed as we might prefer to believe. On Halloween night, when jack-o'-lanterns glow in windows and costumed figures move through the darkness, the witch continues to cast her spell, connecting us to mysteries that are as old as humanity itself and as fresh as our latest attempt to understand our place in a world full of wonder and terror. The gentle creak of settling houses in the October night carries with it echoes of older creaking, the soft footsteps of boards worn smooth by generations of feet. the whispered conversations that drift through hallways long after midnight has tolled. In the quiet hours when the living sleep, our ancestors believed, the dead walk freely through the spaces they once called home, drawn by love and longing back to the familiar comfort of well-known rooms and cherished possessions. Ghosts, perhaps more than any other Halloween creature, spring from the most fundamental of human experiences, our inability to fully accept that death represents an absolute ending. From the earliest human cultures, people have reported encounters with the spirits of the deceased, have felt their presence in empty rooms, have heard their voices calling from beyond the grave. These experiences, whether understood as literal truth or psychological phenomenon, have shaped every human culture's understanding of what it means to die and what it means to be remembered. The ghost stories that began gathering around Halloween emerged from several streams of human belief and experience. The ancient Celtic understanding of Samhain as a time when the veil between worlds grew thin provided a seasonal context that made encounters with spirits seem natural and expected. The Christian tradition of honoring saints and praying for souls in purgatory created a theological framework that allowed for continued existence after death. The universal human experience of grief and loss provided the emotional foundation that made ghost stories feel personally meaningful rather than merely entertaining. But ghosts are more than simple manifestations of the dead. They are creatures of unfinished business, spirits bound to the earthly realm by powerful emotions that death has not been able to sever. Love that refuses to accept separation, guilt that demands resolution, anger that seeks justice, sorrow that cannot find comfort. These emotional states create the chains that bind spirits to particular places and people, making them visible to the living world in ways that peaceful souls needn't be. The houses where ghosts are said to dwell tell stories of their own. They are often old houses, buildings that have sheltered generations of families and witnessed the full spectrum of human experience. Birth and death, joy and sorrow, hope and despair have all left their imprints on these walls, creating what psychical researchers call residual energy, emotional echoes that sensitive individuals can sometimes perceive. Picture a colonial farmhouse in the New England hills, its clapboard siding weathered to silver grey, its windows reflecting the amber light of autumn afternoons. Such a house has known the laughter of children playing by the hearth, the tears of mothers grieving for sons lost to war, the quiet conversations of husbands and wives planning their futures together. It has felt the weight of coffins carried down narrow stairs, has heard the prayers offered for souls departing, has witnessed the slow process by which memories transform into legends. In such a house, a ghost might be the mother who died in childbirth and continues to watch over the children she was forced to leave behind. She might appear in the nursery on quiet nights, a gentle presence that soothes restless babies and ensures that blankets remain tucked securely around small, sleeping forms. Her manifestation would be soft and caring, more comfort than terror, a reminder that love persists even when life does not. Or the ghost might be a soldier who returned from war but could never quite return to peace, whose spirit continues to pace the hallways where his physical body once walked in restless anguish. He might appear at windows, watching for enemies who will never come, or in doorways, eternally preparing to leave for battles that ended long ago. His presence would carry the weight of tragedy, the sorrow of a life interrupted and never fully resumed. The Victorian era marked a particular flowering of ghost lore and spiritual investigation. The rapid social changes of the 19th century, combined with the devastating casualty rates of wars and epidemics, created a generation deeply concerned with questions of life after death. The spiritualist movement, with its seances and mediums, its table rappings and automatic writing, represented a systematic attempt to establish communication with the deceased. Victorian ghost stories reflected this cultural preoccupation with mortality and survival. They were often set in grand houses filled with hidden passages and secret rooms, places where the past seemed to linger in every shadow, and the present felt tenuous and uncertain. These stories frequently featured spirits who had been wronged in life and sought justice in death, or who had died with important messages undelivered and continued to attempt communication from beyond the grave. The Gothic novels that flourished during this period established many of the conventions that continue to shape our understanding of ghosts today. The lonely castle or mansion, the family curse that spans generations, the innocent protagonist who gradually uncovers dark secrets from the past. These elements created a template for ghost stories that writers continue to follow. The ghosts in these stories were often tragic figures, victims of circumstances beyond their control, who deserved sympathy as much as fear. But Victorian ghost stories also reflected deeper anxieties about the nature of progress and change. As traditional ways of life gave way to industrial modernization, as rural communities were abandoned for urban opportunities, as old certainties were challenged by new ideas, people felt a profound sense of loss for what was being left behind. Ghosts became symbols of this lost past, manifestations of values and ways of life that were disappearing, but not entirely forgotten. The Christmas ghost story became a particular tradition during this period, with families gathering around the fire on winter nights to share tales of supernatural encounters. These stories served multiple purposes, providing entertainment during long, dark evenings, reinforcing family bonds through shared experience, and maintaining connection to cultural traditions that might otherwise be forgotten. Charles Dickens, perhaps the most famous practitioner of the Christmas ghost story, understood that ghosts could serve as powerful agents of moral instruction. In A Christmas Carol, the three spirits who visit Ebenezer Scrooge are not merely supernatural phenomena, but representations of different aspects of time and memory. The ghost of Christmas past forces Scrooge to confront the choices that shaped his character, while the ghost of Christmas present shows him the consequences of his actions for others, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come reveals the ultimate destination of his current path. This moral dimension of ghost stories proved particularly important in their evolution toward Halloween entertainment. Unlike monsters that represented external threats or alien forces, ghosts emerged from human experience and emotion. They were manifestations of recognizable feelings and situations, reminders that every life contains elements of both fulfillment and regret. Every death leaves behind both resolution and unfinished business. As Halloween evolved from a religious observance to a secular celebration, Ghosts provided a supernatural element that was both thrilling and comforting. Unlike witches who might represent dangerous knowledge, or vampires who might represent predatory hunger, ghosts were essentially human, driven by familiar emotions and comprehensible motivations. Children could dress as ghosts without invoking truly frightening imagery, simply by draping themselves in white sheets and cutting eye holes for vision. The sheet ghost, perhaps the most iconic Halloween costume, represents the ultimate domestication of supernatural terror. It transforms the mysterious and potentially threatening presence of an actual ghost into something that any child can become, with minimal preparation and expense. The white sheet references traditional burial shrouds and the popular conception of spirits as pale, translucent figures, but it removes all elements of genuine fear or spiritual significance. Yet even in this simplified form, the ghost costume preserves something essential about the experience of encountering the supernatural. The child beneath the sheet becomes temporarily anonymous, transformed into something other than their ordinary self. They experience the world through the limited vision provided by eye holes cut in fabric, seeing familiar surroundings from an altered perspective. They move through space differently, constrained by the draping material, but also freed from normal social expectations and interactions. Ghost walks and haunted house tours have become popular Halloween activities that allow people to explore their fascination with spirits and supernatural phenomena in controlled settings. These events typically combine historical information about actual deaths and tragedies with atmospheric storytelling designed to create the impression of ongoing supernatural activity. Participants can experience the thrill of potential ghostly encounters while remaining safely grounded in rational explanations for any unusual phenomena they might observe. The psychology of ghost belief reflects deep human needs and fears that transcend cultural and historical boundaries. Ghosts provide a way of maintaining connection with deceased loved ones, of believing that death does not represent absolute termination of relationship and memory. They offer explanations for experiences that feel supernatural, but may have natural causes, allowing people to acknowledge the mystery and wonder in their lives without necessarily committing to specific religious or philosophical beliefs. In therapeutic contexts, the concept of ghosts can provide a metaphor for dealing with unresolved grief and trauma. The idea that the dead can return to communicate with the living offers comfort to those struggling with loss, while the notion that ghosts can find peace and move on provides a model for healthy grieving processes. Ghost stories become ways of exploring themes of memory, forgiveness, and emotional healing. As we consider the role of ghosts in our Halloween celebrations, we might reflect on what these spirits represent in our contemporary culture. They are reminders of continuity in a world that often feels fragmented and changing too rapidly for comfort. They represent the persistence of love and memory beyond the physical limitations of individual life. They embody our hope that something essential about human consciousness and relationship survives the dissolution of the body. The gentle ghost who rustles curtains and rearranges furniture speaks to our desire for signs that we are not forgotten, that our presence in the world matters enough to leave traces that others can perceive. The troubled spirit who cannot rest until justice is served reflects our belief that moral actions have consequences that transcend individual lifetimes. The protective ghost who watches over living family members embodies our hope that love creates bonds stronger than death itself. On Halloween night, as candles flicker in windows and shadows dance on walls, as children in white sheets move through neighborhoods in search of treats and adults gather to share stories of supernatural encounters, ghosts continue to serve their ancient function. They remind us that the boundary between past and present, between memory and reality, between the living and the dead, is not as solid as we might prefer to believe. They invite us to consider that the houses we inhabit, the places we love, the relationships we cherish, all contain elements that persist beyond our ordinary understanding of time and mortality. In the soft grey light of dawn, when Halloween night gives way to November morning, the ghosts retreat to whatever realm they inhabit during the daylight hours. But they do not disappear entirely. They remain present in the stories we tell, the memories we preserve, the love that refuses to accept the finality of death. They dwell in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the moment between sleeping and waking, in the pause between one breath and the next, waiting for the next October night when the veil grows thin and they can walk once more among the living. In the mist-shrouded mountains of Eastern Europe, where ancient forests whisper secrets in languages older than written history, there arose legends of the undead that would eventually cross oceans and centuries to find their place among our Halloween creatures. These stories were born in regions where winter lasted half the year and darkness came early, where isolated villages clung to mountainsides like scattered jewels against the vast indifference of wilderness, where life was harsh and death came often and sometimes in ways that left questions unanswered and fears unresolved. The vampire, as we know this creature today, emerged from a complex web of folklore, religious belief, and medical misunderstanding that reflected the daily realities of life in medieval and early modern Europe. In times when disease could sweep through communities with devastating speed, when the causes of illness and death were poorly understood, when burial practices were sometimes hasty and incomplete, it was perhaps inevitable that stories would arise about the dead who refused to remain properly deceased. The earliest vampire legends were quite different from the sophisticated aristocrats who would later populate Gothic novels and Hollywood films. These original vampires were peasant figures, recently deceased members of local communities who had somehow returned from the grave to prey upon their former neighbors. They were not elegant or seductive, but crude and terrible, appearing much as they had at the moment of death, but now animated by an unnatural hunger for the blood of the living. These early vampires were often understood to be the result of improper death or inadequate burial. A person who had died violently, who had been excommunicated from the church, who had lived as a criminal or heretic, who had committed suicide, or who had simply been buried without proper religious rites, might find themselves unable to rest peacefully in the grave. Instead, they would rise as vampires, driven by an insatiable thirst for blood and a malevolent desire to drag others into their cursed state. The medical knowledge of the time contributed significantly to vampire beliefs. Bodies that had been buried quickly, especially during times of plague or epidemic, sometimes showed signs of apparent continued life when graves were later opened. What we now understand as natural processes of decomposition, such as the movement of gases through decomposing tissue or the settling of blood in newly dead bodies, were interpreted as evidence that corpses were somehow still alive and feeding. The bloated appearance of bodies in certain stages of decomposition suggested that vampires had been gorging themselves on blood. The discovery of what appeared to be fresh blood around the mouth of a corpse was actually the natural result of fluids being expelled from the lungs, but to medieval observers it seemed clear evidence of vampiric feeding. Hair and nails that appeared to have grown after death, actually the result of skin shrinkage, making existing hair and nails more prominent, were taken as proof that the dead were somehow continuing to live and grow. These observations led to the development of elaborate practices for preventing vampirism or dealing with suspected vampires. Bodies might be buried with religious objects such as crosses or rosaries, with their mouths filled with garlic or holy water, with stakes driven through their hearts, or heavy stones placed on their chests. In extreme cases, suspected vampires might be exhumed and subjected to various forms of destruction, including burning, dismemberment, or burial at crossroads where evil spirits were thought to be confused and unable to find their way. The garlic that became so strongly associated with vampire lore served multiple practical purposes in these early traditions. Garlic was known to have medicinal properties and was often used as protection against disease, making it a natural choice for warding off creatures associated with death and decay. Its strong smell was believed to be offensive to evil spirits, while its association with health and vitality made it symbolically appropriate as a defense against the undead. The cross and other Christian symbols were believed to be particularly powerful against vampires because these creatures were understood to be fundamentally unholy, beings who had been rejected by God and were therefore vulnerable to sacred objects and prayers. The belief that vampires could not cross running water, enter homes uninvited, or approach consecrated ground reflected this understanding of vampirism as a spiritual as well as physical condition. As these folk beliefs spread across Europe, they were shaped by local customs and religious practices. In Orthodox Christian regions, vampires were often associated with heresy and religious dissent, reflecting the Church's concern with maintaining doctrinal purity. In Catholic areas, vampirism was more likely to be connected with specific sins or moral failings that had cut the deceased off from divine grace. In regions where old pagan beliefs persisted alongside Christianity, vampires might be understood as manifestations of ancient evil that Christianity had not yet fully conquered. The vampire folklore of Romania and surrounding regions proved particularly influential in shaping later literary treatments of the vampire theme. Here, in the homeland of the historical Vlad the Impaler, who would eventually become associated with the fictional Count Dracula, vampire beliefs were especially detailed and persistent. Romanian vampires, known as strigoi, were believed to be capable of shape-shifting, often taking the form of wolves, bats, or mist. They could become invisible at will and possessed supernatural strength and speed that made them formidable adversaries. But perhaps most significantly, Romanian vampire lore included the concept of the vampire as a figure of aristocratic evil, a being who used supernatural powers to dominate and exploit ordinary people. This political dimension of vampire mythology reflected the real-world experiences of peasants living under feudal systems where local nobles possessed near absolute power over their subjects' lives and deaths. The transformation of the vampire from peasant revenant to aristocratic predator occurred gradually through the 18th and 19th centuries, as European writers discovered the dramatic potential of vampire folklore. Early literary vampires, such as those appearing in German and English poems and stories, began to display characteristics that would become standard elements of the vampire tradition: supernatural beauty, aristocratic bearing, seductive powers, and a tragic awareness of their own cursed condition. The vampire's association with nobility served multiple literary purposes. It allowed writers to explore themes of power and corruption, to examine the ways that privilege could be used to exploit the vulnerable, to critique social systems that allowed some individuals to prey upon others with impunity. The vampire nobleman was a perfect metaphor for the ways that aristocratic power could drain the life from ordinary people, literally in the case of blood drinking, and figuratively in the case of economic and social exploitation. The romantic movement of the early 19th century found in vampires particularly compelling figures for exploring themes of passion, transgression, and the relationship between love and death. Vampire stories became vehicles for examining sexual desire that was both irresistible and destructive, relationships that offered ecstasy and damnation in equal measure, love that transcended normal human limitations, but at a terrible cost. The vampire's immortality made them ideal characters for exploring questions about the meaning and value of human life. A being who had lived for centuries would have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of countless individuals, the endless cycle of human folly and wisdom. Such a perspective might lead to profound wisdom or to terrible cynicism, to a deep appreciation for human experience or to a complete detachment from human concerns. The publication of Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897 marked the culmination of the vampire's literary evolution and established the template that would influence vampire stories for more than a century. Stoker's Count Dracula combined elements from various European vampire traditions with contemporary concerns about immigration, disease, and social change. The novel presented vampirism as a kind of infection that could spread from east to west, from the primitive to the civilized, threatening to undermine the foundations of modern society. But Stoker's vampire was also a deeply sympathetic figure, a being cursed with eternal existence who remembered what it was like to be human, but could never return to that state. This tragic dimension of the vampire character would prove crucial to its eventual incorporation into Halloween celebrations, providing a supernatural creature that could be both frightening and pitiable, both threatening and romantic. The vampire's association with autumn and Halloween developed naturally from several aspects of vampire folklore. The seasonal connection to death and decay that characterized October made it an appropriate time for creatures associated with the undead. The vampire's nocturnal nature aligned with the longer nights of autumn and the approach of winter. The themes of harvest and abundance that characterized Halloween celebrations created an ironic contrast with the vampire's eternal hunger and inability to find satisfaction. In modern Halloween celebrations, the vampire has become one of the most popular costume choices, allowing people to explore themes of power, seduction, and transgression in a safe, playful context. Vampire costumes typically emphasize the creature's aristocratic associations through formal evening wear, capes, and elegant accessories, while fake fangs and theatrical makeup reference the vampire's predatory nature without invoking genuine fear. The domestication of the vampire for Halloween purposes reflects broader changes in how supernatural creatures are understood in contemporary culture. The vampire, who might once have represented a serious threat to religious and social order, has become a figure of fantasy and entertainment, a character in a costume drama that allows participants to experiment with different aspects of identity and desire. Yet something of the vampire's original power persists even in these sanitized versions. The vampire continues to represent the appeal of the forbidden, the attraction of power without moral constraint, the seductive possibility of transcending ordinary human limitations. On Halloween night, when children don plastic fangs and adults drape themselves in black capes, they are participating in a tradition that connects them to centuries of folklore about the thin boundary between life and death, the dangerous allure of the otherworldly, and the persistent human fascination with creatures who embody both our deepest fears and our most secret desires. As jack-o'-lanterns cast their flickering light across October lawns and costumed figures move through the darkness in search of treats, the vampire continues to stalk through our imaginations, reminding us that some hungers can never be satisfied, some curses can never be broken, and some forms of love are too dangerous for the living to survive. In the gentle terror of Halloween night, the vampire finds its perfect home, a creature of darkness celebrating in the safe shadows of a holiday that transforms fear into fun and monsters into neighbors. In the deep forests of medieval Europe, where moonlight filtered through ancient oak and ash to create patterns of silver and shadow on the moss-covered ground, hunters would sometimes report encounters that chilled their blood and sent them racing back to the safety of village walls. They spoke of creatures that walked on two legs like men, but possessed the strength and hunger of wolves, beings that could shift between human and animal form with supernatural ease, monsters that embodied the worst aspects of both civilized intelligence and wild ferocity. The werewolf, perhaps more than any other Halloween creature, represents humanity's complex relationship with its own animal nature. These legends emerged from the fundamental tension between our self-image as rational, civilized beings and our awareness of the savage impulses that lurk beneath the surface of social convention. The werewolf embodied the fear that human civilization was only a thin veneer, that underneath our carefully constructed social roles and moral codes, we remained predators governed by hunger and instinct. The earliest werewolf stories arose in cultures where wolves were both a practical threat and a powerful spiritual symbol. In the vast forests that once covered much of Europe, wolves were real dangers to livestock and occasionally to human beings, especially during harsh winters when other prey became scarce. But wolves were also admired for their intelligence, their loyalty to their pack, their skill as hunters, and their ability to survive in conditions that would defeat other creatures. This dual nature of wolves, both threatening and admirable, was reflected in the folklore that developed around them. Many cultures had traditions of warriors who could take on the characteristics of wolves, gaining their strength and ferocity in battle. Shamanic traditions often included the ability to assume animal forms, with wolves being particularly powerful spirit guides. The boundary between beneficial shapeshifting and cursed transformation was often unclear, depending on the context and the intention of the practitioner. The classical world contributed significant elements to werewolf mythology. Greek legends told of Lycaon, a king who was transformed into a wolf by Zeus as punishment for his cruelty and impiety. This story established a pattern that would persist through centuries of werewolf lore. The idea that lycanthropy was often a curse imposed as divine punishment for particularly heinous crimes or moral failures. The transformation into a wolf was not just a physical change, but a spiritual degradation, a reduction from human status to animal brutality. Roman writers elaborated on these themes, developing the concept of lycanthropy as a medical or psychological condition rather than simply a supernatural curse. They described individuals who believed themselves to be wolves, who howled and hunted like wild animals, who lost their human reason and civilized behavior. These accounts, while they reflected real observations of mental illness or peculiar behavior, were interpreted through the lens of supernatural belief and contributed to the growing body of werewolf folklore. The medieval period saw werewolf beliefs become deeply intertwined with Christian theology and legal practice. The Church taught that Satan could grant his servants the power to assume animal forms, making werewolfism a species of witchcraft punishable by death. Legal codes developed specific procedures for dealing with accused werewolves, who were often charged with both supernatural transformation and the specific crimes they had allegedly committed while in wolf form. The werewolf trials that occurred across Europe during the late medieval and early modern periods revealed the deep anxieties that these creatures represented. Unlike witch trials, which often focused on women accused of maleficent magic, werewolf trials typically involved men accused of particularly brutal forms of violence. The werewolf served as an explanation for crimes so savage that they seemed to transcend normal human capacity for evil, acts that could only be understood as the work of creatures that were no longer fully human. One of the most famous werewolf trials involved Peter Stump, a German farmer who confessed in 1589 to having made a pact with the devil that gave him a magical belt, allowing him to transform into a wolf. Under torture, Stump admitted to 25 years of lycanthropic violence, including cannibalism and the murder of his own son. While modern scholars recognize these confessions as the product of judicial torture and mass hysteria, they reveal the kinds of fears and explanations that werewolf beliefs provided for medieval communities confronted with inexplicable violence. The lunar connection that became central to werewolf mythology developed gradually through various cultural influences. The moon had always been associated with transformation and change in human folklore. Its monthly cycle of waxing and waning providing a natural metaphor for the cyclical nature of werewolf transformation. The full moon, in particular, was believed to be a time when supernatural forces were at their strongest, and the boundary between natural and unnatural became most permeable. This lunar association served multiple narrative purposes in werewolf stories. It provided a predictable schedule for transformations, creating dramatic tension as characters and readers anticipated the approaching full moon. It connected lycanthropy to natural cycles rather than purely random supernatural events, making the condition seem more like a natural phenomenon that had been corrupted or perverted. It also reinforced the connection between werewolves and the night, the time when civilized behavior gave way to primal instincts and social controls were weakest. The medical understanding of lycanthropy evolved significantly during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. Scholars began to distinguish between actual belief in shape-shifting and various forms of mental illness that might cause individuals to believe they were wolves or to behave in wolf-like ways. Clinical lycanthropy was recognized as a psychological condition that could be studied and potentially treated, rather than a supernatural curse requiring execution or exorcism. This medicalization of werewolf beliefs reflected broader changes in European intellectual culture, as scientific approaches to understanding human behavior began to supplement or replace supernatural explanations. The werewolf gradually transformed from a literal monster to a metaphor for the savage impulses that civilized people worked to suppress, a symbol of humanity's ongoing struggle to control its own darker nature. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries found in werewolves particularly compelling figures for exploring themes of internal conflict and dual nature. Romantic writers were fascinated by the idea that a single individual could contain both civilized and savage aspects, that the human personality might be fundamentally divided between rational restraint and passionate impulse. The werewolf provided a powerful metaphor for this internal struggle, embodying the romantic belief that civilization required the suppression of natural instincts that were both necessary and dangerous. Literature began to present werewolves as tragic figures rather than simply evil monsters. These new werewolves were often portrayed as unwilling victims of their condition, individuals who maintained their human consciousness and moral awareness even while being compelled to commit terrible acts in their transformed state. This created opportunities for exploring themes of personal responsibility, moral agency, and the relationship between intention and action. The werewolf's evolution toward inclusion in Halloween celebrations was influenced by several factors. The creature's connection to autumn hunting seasons made it seasonally appropriate for October festivities. Its association with the full moon aligned with Halloween's nocturnal character and its emphasis on mysterious, supernatural phenomena. Most importantly, the werewolf's essentially human nature made it a more relatable and less threatening figure than purely alien monsters. In modern Halloween contexts, the werewolf has become a popular costume choice that allows people to explore their own relationship with wildness and civilization. Werewolf costumes typically emphasize the creature's dual nature through combinations of human clothing with animal features such as fangs, claws, and artificial fur. The transformation aspect of lycanthropy is often suggested through torn clothing and disheveled appearance, implying the violence of the change from human to wolf form. The therapeutic metaphor embedded in werewolf mythology has found new relevance in contemporary psychology and self-help literature. The idea that everyone contains both civilized and savage aspects, that personal growth requires acknowledging and integrating these different aspects of the self rather than simply suppressing the problematic elements, resonates with modern approaches to mental health and personal development. The werewolf's pack mentality also provides a model for understanding human social behavior that remains relevant in contemporary contexts. Just as wolves are highly social animals whose individual behavior is shaped by pack dynamics, humans are fundamentally social beings whose personal identity and moral choices are influenced by group membership and social pressures. The werewolf reminds us that our animal heritage includes not only individual aggression, but also social cooperation and loyalty. Environmental concerns have given werewolf mythology new symbolic significance in recent decades. As wilderness areas disappear and human activity threatens wolf populations and other wildlife, the werewolf has become a symbol of humanity's conflicted relationship with the natural world. The creature represents both our fear of wild nature and our recognition that something essential is lost when we completely separate ourselves from our animal origins. In Halloween celebrations, werewolves continue to serve as reminders of the thin line between civilization and savagery, between the social roles we perform and the instincts we suppress. They invite us to consider what aspects of our animal nature we have lost in the process of becoming civilized, and whether some of these losses might represent genuine impoverishments rather than necessary sacrifices. The full moon that rises over Halloween night illuminates not only costumed children trick-or-treating and adults attending parties, but also the symbolic landscape of human nature itself. The werewolf prowling through that landscape reminds us that transformation is always possible, that the boundaries we draw between different aspects of ourselves are more fluid than we might prefer to admit, and that the wildness we think we have tamed still runs in our blood, waiting for the right moment to howl at the moon and remind us who we really are beneath all our careful social conditioning. As autumn settles into its deeper rhythms and Halloween approaches, the werewolf takes its place among the creatures that populate our seasonal imagination, a figure that embodies both the terror and the wonder of being human in a world where civilization and wilderness, reason and instinct, love and hunger exist in constant tension. In the gentle frightening of Halloween night, the werewolf finds its perfect home, a monster that is also a mirror, reflecting back to us the complex truth of our own dual nature. In the golden sands of Egypt, where the Nile flows through landscapes that have witnessed 5,000 years of human civilization, archaeologists working in the 19th century made discoveries that would capture the imagination of the Western world and eventually add a new figure to our collection of Halloween monsters. They found tombs filled with treasures beyond imagining, wall paintings that glowed with colors as fresh as the day they were applied, and most mysteriously of all, the carefully preserved bodies of kings and queens who had died millennia ago, but appeared to sleep rather than decay. The mummy, wrapped in linen bandages and surrounded by the grave goods necessary for the afterlife, emerged from ancient Egyptian religious beliefs about death and immortality that were far more complex and sophisticated than early European scholars initially understood. For the Egyptians, death was not an ending, but a transformation, a passage from one state of existence to another that required careful preparation and proper ritual to navigate successfully. The process of mummification was both a practical technique for preserving bodies and a sacred ritual that prepared the deceased for their journey through the underworld. The removal of internal organs, the treatment of the body with natron and resins, the careful wrapping in hundreds of yards of linen strips, the placement of protective amulets between the layers of bandages. All of these procedures were designed to ensure that the physical form would remain intact, while the soul traveled through the challenges that awaited it in the realm of the dead. But the mummies that European explorers discovered in Egyptian tombs were understood through very different cultural lenses than those that had created them. Victorian England was fascinated by death and mourning, by the preservation of memory and the possibility of communication with the deceased, but it was also a society deeply committed to progress and scientific advancement. The mummy represented a fascinating contradiction, evidence of ancient sophistication combined with practices that seemed primitive and superstitious to modern observers. The unwrapping of mummies became a popular form of entertainment in 19th century Europe and America. These events, often conducted in grand halls before audiences of society figures and scholars, were presented as scientific investigations that would reveal the secrets of ancient Egyptian medicine and preservation techniques. In reality, they were often theatrical spectacles that destroyed irreplaceable archaeological evidence while satisfying public curiosity about death and decay. The Gothic imagination of the Victorian era found in mummies particularly compelling subjects for horror stories. Unlike vampires who were seductive and werewolves who were savage, mummies were tragic figures, beings who had been disturbed from their eternal rest by the curiosity and greed of modern grave robbers. They represented the consequences of violating ancient sacred spaces, the price that had to be paid for disturbing forces that were meant to remain undisturbed. The literary mummy that emerged from this cultural fascination was often portrayed as a figure seeking revenge for the desecration of their tomb or the theft of their treasures. These stories typically involved archaeologists or collectors who acquired Egyptian artifacts only to find themselves pursued by vengeful spirits seeking to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The mummy's rapt appearance and shambling gait made them ideal monsters for stories that emphasized atmospheric dread rather than sudden shocks. But perhaps more significantly, the mummy represented anxieties about the relationship between past and present, between traditional beliefs and modern skepticism. The discovery of intact Egyptian tombs forced Victorian society to confront evidence of civilizations that had achieved remarkable sophistication thousands of years before Christianity, that had developed complex religious and philosophical systems based on very different assumptions about the nature of reality and human destiny. The mummy's bandages became one of its most distinctive and symbolically significant features. Unlike other monsters whose appearance reflected their supernatural nature, the mummy's wrapped form was entirely artificial, the result of human intervention rather than magical transformation. The bandages served practical purposes in the mummification process, but in the context of horror stories, they became symbols of concealment and disguise, hiding whatever mysteries lay beneath their carefully wound layers. The gradual decay of these bandages, often portrayed in mummy stories as occurring when the preserved body was exposed to air after centuries of tomb darkness, suggested the inevitable victory of time over human attempts to achieve immortality. The mummy whose wrappings fell away to reveal crumbling flesh beneath embodied the futility of trying to preserve the physical body beyond its natural lifespan. Yet the mummy was also a figure of tremendous power and knowledge. Having lived in ancient times and survived through the centuries, mummies possessed secrets that modern people had forgotten, understanding of magical practices and spiritual truths that had been lost with the passage of time. This made them valuable as well as dangerous, sources of wisdom as well as threat. The curse of the mummy became one of the most enduring elements of mummy mythology, a concept that suggested disturbing ancient tombs would result in supernatural punishment for the violators. These curses were often portrayed as delayed but inevitable, striking down tomb robbers and archaeologists through a series of apparently natural but suspiciously convenient deaths and disasters. The most famous example of an alleged mummy's curse involved the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon. When Carnarvon died of an infected mosquito bite several months after the tomb's opening, newspapers around the world seized upon the story as evidence that the pharaoh's spirit was taking revenge on those who had disturbed his rest. Despite the fact that Carter himself lived for many more years and that most of the expedition members suffered no unusual misfortunes, the story of King Tut's curse captured public imagination and reinforced the association between mummies and supernatural retribution. The mummy's integration into Halloween celebrations occurred gradually as the creature evolved from a figure of archaeological mystery to a character in popular entertainment. Unlike vampires or werewolves, whose folklore had deep European roots, the mummy was an imported monster, a creature borrowed from Egyptian culture and adapted to serve Western storytelling purposes. This process of cultural borrowing and adaptation reflected broader patterns of 19th and early 20th century imperialism, as European and American societies appropriated elements from other cultures while often misunderstanding or misrepresenting their original significance. The mummy became a symbol of exotic mystery rather than a representation of sophisticated ancient religious beliefs about death and afterlife. In the context of Halloween, the mummy offered several advantages as a costume choice. The wrapped appearance was relatively easy to simulate using bandages or torn fabric, making it an accessible option for people of limited means or artistic skill. The mummy's slow, shambling movement style was easier to maintain throughout an evening of celebration than more active monster personas. Most importantly, the mummy was frightening enough to satisfy Halloween's supernatural requirements, while remaining gentle enough for family-friendly celebrations. The mummy costume also provided opportunities for creativity and personal expression. Different approaches to wrapping, different degrees of decay and deterioration, different accessories and props could create distinct variations on the basic mummy theme. Some mummy costumes emphasized the creature's ancient dignity, while others focused on horror and decomposition. Still others played up the comedic potential of a monster who might trip over its own bandages or struggle with daily tasks using hands wrapped in linen. Children's mummy costumes often emphasized the playful rather than frightening aspects of the character. These versions typically featured bright white bandages and minimal suggestions of decay, creating a monster that was more silly than scary. The image of a small child wrapped in clean white bandages, stumbling slightly as they navigated trick-or-treat routes, transformed the fearsome ancient king into a gentle figure of Halloween fun. The mummy's place in Halloween celebrations also reflected changing attitudes toward death and mortality in modern society. While the original Egyptian mummies represented sophisticated religious beliefs about preservation and afterlife, the Halloween mummy served as a way of playing with death imagery in a safe, controlled context. The wrapped figure allowed people to explore themes of mortality and decay while maintaining enough distance and artificiality to avoid genuine distress. This domestication of death imagery served important psychological functions, particularly for children learning to understand mortality and loss. The mummy provided a way of encountering death symbolically, of becoming familiar with the visual and conceptual elements associated with human mortality, without having to confront the reality of actual death and grief. The mummy's essential gentleness as a Halloween monster also reflected a broader trend toward making Halloween celebrations more inclusive and less genuinely frightening. Unlike vampires who drained blood or werewolves who tore their victims apart, mummies were typically portrayed as slow-moving creatures whose primary threat came from their supernatural powers rather than their physical violence. This made them suitable for celebrations that included young children or sensitive individuals who might be disturbed by more explicitly violent monster imagery. In therapeutic contexts, the mummy costume could provide opportunities for individuals to explore themes of transformation and concealment in safe, playful ways. The process of wrapping oneself in bandages created a physical sensation of being enclosed and protected while also being constrained and limited. This could serve as a metaphor for various psychological states and personal experiences, from feeling overwhelmed by circumstances beyond one's control to experiencing the protective but limiting effects of defensive behaviors. The mummy's association with ancient wisdom and hidden knowledge also made it an appropriate figure for Halloween's connection to mystery and the supernatural. In a holiday that celebrated the thinning of veils between worlds, the mummy represented knowledge from the distant past that might be relevant to contemporary concerns, wisdom preserved through centuries of sleep that could offer insights unavailable through ordinary means. As Halloween night settles over neighborhoods where costumed figures move slowly through the darkness, some wrapped in the ancient dignity of linen bandages, the mummy continues to serve its role as one of our gentlest monsters. It reminds us that death is not always an ending, that the past continues to influence the present in ways both mysterious and profound, and that some forms of preservation require transformation rather than simple maintenance. The mummy shuffling through October nights carries with it echoes of ancient beliefs about the persistence of consciousness beyond physical death, the possibility that love and knowledge can survive the dissolution of the body, and the hope that something essential about human experience transcends the apparent finality of the grave. In the warm glow of porch lights and the rustle of dried leaves, the mummy finds its perfect home among Halloween's collection of creatures, a monster that teaches us that some awakenings come only after very long sleeps, and that the most important journeys sometimes require us to be very carefully wrapped for the passage ahead. In the laboratories of early 19th century Europe, where candles flickered against brass instruments and glass vessels, where the smell of chemicals mingled with the dampness of stone walls, ambitious men pursued knowledge that seemed to promise power over the fundamental forces of life and death. It was an age of scientific revolution, when electricity was a new and mysterious force, when the boundaries between physics and metaphysics seemed permeable, when the question of what distinguished living matter from dead matter occupied the minds of natural philosophers and medical researchers. Into this atmosphere of intellectual excitement and scientific ambition, Mary Shelley introduced a creature who would become one of our most enduring and complex Halloween monsters. But unlike the vampires and werewolves who emerged from centuries of folklore, Frankenstein's monster was born from contemporary anxieties about scientific progress, from questions about the proper limits of human knowledge, from fears about what might happen when human ambition overreached human wisdom. The creation of Frankenstein's monster began, as Mary Shelley herself recounted, during a summer spent in Switzerland with Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, and John Polidori, when unseasonable weather kept the group indoors and led to a competition to write ghost stories. But the tale that emerged from that stormy summer of 1816 was far more than a simple ghost story. It was a profound meditation on the nature of creation and responsibility, on the relationship between knowledge and ethics, on what it means to be human in an age when human power seemed to be expanding beyond traditional limits. The scientific context that inspired Shelley's novel was particularly rich and unsettling. Luigi Galvani's experiments with electrical stimulation of dead tissue had demonstrated that electricity could cause muscles to contract even after death, suggesting that some spark of life might persist in dead bodies or even be artificially introduced to them. The boundary between life and death, which had seemed absolute and unchanging, suddenly appeared more flexible than anyone had previously imagined. Contemporary medical practice also contributed to the atmosphere of scientific possibilities that informed Shelley's imagination. Grave robbing was common, as medical schools required fresh corpses for anatomical study, but legal sources of bodies were limited. The idea that dead bodies might be gathered together and somehow combined or reanimated was not entirely fantastic in a world where resurrection, men plied their trade in churchyards, and medical students gathered around dissection tables to study the mechanics of human anatomy. But Shelley's genius lay not in the scientific plausibility of her creature's creation, but in her exploration of what such creation might mean for both creator and creature. Victor Frankenstein's ambition to unlock the secrets of life reflects the broader aspirations of Enlightenment science, the belief that human reason and experimentation could eventually understand and control all natural phenomena. His success in creating life represents the fulfillment of these aspirations, but also their ultimate inadequacy when faced with the ethical complexities of actually wielding such power. The creature that emerges from Frankenstein's laboratory is perhaps the most sympathetic monster in all of literature. Unlike vampires who choose their evil, or werewolves who surrender to their animal nature, Frankenstein's monster begins as an innocent being, created without his consent, abandoned by his maker, forced to learn about the world through painful experience rather than loving guidance. His monstrosity is not inherent, but learned, a response to the cruelty and rejection he encounters from the human beings he initially hopes to join. The monster's eloquence, which often surprises readers expecting a simple brute, reflects Shelley's understanding that intelligence without compassion, knowledge without wisdom, can become monstrous in its own right. The creature reads Paradise Lost, Plutarch's Lives, and the Sorrows of Young Werther, educating himself in human literature and philosophy. Yet this education only deepens his sense of isolation and injustice. He understands what he has been denied, what he can never possess, and this knowledge transforms his initial innocence into justified rage. The relationship between Victor Frankenstein and his creature serves as a powerful metaphor for the responsibilities that accompany creative power. Frankenstein's abandonment of his creation immediately after bringing it to life reflects the tendency of scientific progress to focus on the achievement of new capabilities without adequate consideration of their consequences. The monster's subsequent demand that Frankenstein create a companion for him, and Frankenstein's ultimate refusal to do so, explores the ongoing obligations that creators have toward their creations. This theme of creative responsibility has proven remarkably prescient in an age of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and other technologies that grant humans unprecedented power to reshape the natural world. The questions that Shelley raised about the limits of scientific ambition, the ethics of creation, and the responsibilities of creators remain urgently relevant in contemporary discussions about technological development and its potential consequences. The monster's appearance, as Shelley described it, emphasized his artificial nature and the incompleteness of Frankenstein's creative success. 8 feet tall, with yellow skin barely concealing the muscle and arteries beneath, with flowing black hair and white teeth that contrasted horribly with his watery eyes and straight black lips, the creature was beautiful in his individual features, but revolting in their combination. This description suggests that Frankenstein had mastered the mechanics of life, but failed to understand its essential harmony, had assembled the parts without grasping the whole. The creature's superhuman strength and endurance, his ability to survive in the Arctic wastes where ordinary humans would perish, his intelligence and capacity for learning all suggest that he represents an improvement on human nature in some respects. Yet these very improvements contribute to his isolation and monstrosity, making him too different from ordinary humans to find acceptance among them. This paradox reflects Enlightenment tensions about human perfectibility, suggesting that the attempt to improve human nature might actually destroy what makes us human. The seasonal associations that connect Frankenstein's monster to Halloween emerged gradually as the creature moved from literary character to popular culture icon. The novel itself was published in 1818, but did not immediately become associated with autumn celebrations. The connection developed through theatrical adaptations, particularly the melodramatic stage versions that emphasized the monster's frightening appearance while simplifying the novel's complex moral and philosophical themes. The monster's association with graveyards and dissection, with scientific laboratories and electrical experiments, aligned naturally with Halloween's emphasis on death and supernatural phenomena. The creature represented a unique form of resurrection, neither religious miracle nor supernatural curse, but scientific achievement that had somehow gone terribly wrong. This made him an appropriate figure for a holiday that celebrated the blurring of boundaries between life and death, natural and unnatural. The visual iconography that developed around Frankenstein's monster proved particularly important for his integration into Halloween celebrations. The square head, the neck bolts, the lumbering gait, the crude clothing, all of these elements came not from Shelley's novel, but from Boris Karloff's portrayal in the 1931 Universal Studios film. This cinematic version of the monster emphasized his artificial nature and childlike innocence while making him visually distinctive enough to serve as an immediately recognizable costume choice. The Karloff monster's essential gentleness, despite his frightening appearance, made him particularly suitable for family Halloween celebrations. Unlike other monsters who might be genuinely threatening, this Frankenstein's monster was clearly a victim rather than a villain, a being more to be pitied than feared. Children could dress as the monster without invoking truly scary imagery, while adults could appreciate the deeper themes of isolation and belonging that the character represented. The monster's status as an artificial being also made him an interesting choice for costume purposes. Unlike vampires or werewolves who represented transformations of human nature, the Frankenstein monster was assembled rather than transformed, created rather than cursed. This made the costume process itself a form of recreation, as participants assembled their own version of the monster through makeup, clothing choices, and behavioral modifications. The educational potential of the Frankenstein story has made it a popular choice for Halloween events that seek to combine entertainment with learning. The novel's exploration of scientific ethics, its examination of prejudice and social rejection, its meditation on the responsibilities of creators toward their creations, all provide rich material for discussions that can accompany Halloween celebrations in educational settings. The therapeutic metaphors embedded in the Frankenstein story have also found relevance in contemporary psychology and counseling. The monster's experience of abandonment and rejection, his struggle to find identity and belonging, his oscillation between love and rage, all reflect patterns that appear in various forms of human psychological development and healing. The story provides a framework for exploring themes of self-acceptance, social integration, and the management of anger and disappointment. In our contemporary context, Frankenstein's monster has become a symbol for various forms of technological anxiety and ethical concern. As artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated, as genetic engineering becomes more powerful, as human enhancement technologies become more feasible, the questions that Shelley raised about the consequences of scientific ambition become increasingly urgent and practical. The monster walking through Halloween night, bolt-necked and square-headed, shambling gently past jack-o'-lanterns and through neighborhoods where children gather candy and adults share stories, carries with him these deeper resonances. He reminds us that creation always involves responsibility, that knowledge without wisdom can become dangerous, that the attempt to transcend human limitations might actually threaten what makes us human. Yet he also embodies hope for redemption and understanding. In Shelley's novel, the monster retains his capacity for both love and learning, despite the cruelty he has experienced. His tragedy lies not in his nature, but in his circumstances, not in what he is, but in who he has been treated. This suggests that even the most apparently monstrous beings might be capable of transformation if they were to encounter genuine compassion and acceptance. On Halloween night, as this gentlest of monsters moves through landscapes lit by candle glow and starlight, he continues to ask the questions that Mary Shelley posed 2 centuries ago about what we owe to our creations, what we risk when we seek to transcend natural limits, and what it truly means to be human in a world where human power grows ever greater. In the warm community of Halloween celebration, the monster finds a temporary home, a brief respite from isolation, a reminder that even the most artificial beings can participate in the ancient human ritual of gathering together to share stories and sweets on the night when all boundaries become permeable and all creatures find welcome. In the humid heat of Caribbean islands, where drums echo through tropical nights and the boundary between the living and dead is understood to be more fluid than European traditions might suggest, there emerged stories of the walking dead that would eventually travel across oceans and centuries to find a place among our Halloween creatures. But these original zombies were very different from the shambling hordes that would later populate movie screens and Halloween celebrations, emerging instead from complex spiritual traditions that viewed death and consciousness as involving multiple layers of existence that could be separated and manipulated under certain circumstances. The word zombie itself derives from Nzambe, a term used in various West and Central African languages to refer to spiritual entities or supernatural forces. When African peoples were forcibly transported to the Caribbean as enslaved laborers, they brought with them sophisticated religious and spiritual systems that included detailed understandings of the soul's relationship to the body and the ways that this relationship could be disrupted or manipulated by those who possessed the proper knowledge and authority. In the Vodou traditions that developed in Haiti through the synthesis of African religious practices with elements of Christianity and indigenous Caribbean beliefs, the zombie represented a specific and terrifying form of spiritual violation. According to these beliefs, death involved the separation of multiple aspects of the soul from the physical body, but under certain circumstances, a powerful sorcerer known as a bokor could capture part of the soul and use it to reanimate the body as a mindless servant. This original zombie was not a creature of random violence or infectious disease, but a victim of spiritual enslavement. A being whose essential self had been captured and whose body had been reduced to a tool for performing manual labor under the complete control of the sorcerer who had created them. The horror of zombification lay not in the threat that zombies posed to others, but in the complete loss of autonomy and identity that the condition represented. The creation of zombies, according to traditional Vodou belief, required extensive knowledge of poisons and herbs that could induce a death-like state from which the victim could later be revived. The Bokor would administer these substances to a chosen target, typically someone who had violated important social norms or failed to fulfill obligations to the community. The victim would appear to die and would be buried according to normal customs, but the Bokor would later retrieve the body and use additional preparations to revive it in a diminished state. These revived individuals would retain basic motor functions and the ability to follow simple commands, but would lose the aspects of consciousness that made them fully human. They could work, but could not think independently, could move, but could not speak coherently, could exist, but could not truly live. They were condemned to a state of existence that was neither life nor death, but something in between, a condition that represented the ultimate violation of human dignity and spiritual autonomy. The social context in which these beliefs developed was crucial to their meaning and function. In communities where people had been forcibly separated from their homeland and enslaved by others, where individual autonomy was already severely constrained and personal identity was under constant assault, the idea of spiritual enslavement represented the ultimate horror. Zombification was not just death, but the continuation of bondage beyond death, the denial of even the basic rest that the grave was supposed to provide. These traditions served important social functions within Caribbean communities. The fear of zombification encouraged adherence to community norms and proper behavior toward family and neighbors. The belief that spiritual violations would result in spiritual punishment provided a form of social control that operated independently of formal legal or political systems. The detailed knowledge required to create zombies was held by religious specialists whose authority and power were reinforced by their mastery of these dangerous practices. But the zombie traditions also reflected deeper philosophical understandings about the nature of consciousness and identity that differed significantly from European materialist approaches to these questions. The ability to separate different aspects of the soul from each other and from the body implied a complex understanding of human consciousness as involving multiple components that could exist independently under certain circumstances. When European and American ethnographers began studying Caribbean religious traditions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they encountered zombie beliefs through the lens of their own cultural assumptions and prejudices. These observers often dismissed the spiritual and philosophical sophistication of Vodou traditions while focusing on the more sensational aspects of zombie stories that could be presented as evidence of primitive superstition or exotic barbarism. The transformation of zombies from spiritual victims to flesh-eating monsters began with their appropriation by Western popular culture, particularly through the horror fiction and films that emerged in the early to mid-20th century. Writers and filmmakers found in zombie imagery a powerful metaphor for various forms of social anxiety and cultural fear, but they typically stripped away the original spiritual context that had given these beliefs their meaning and power. The first wave of zombie movies, particularly those produced by Hollywood studios in the 1930s and 1940s, often maintained some connection to Caribbean sources by setting their stories in tropical locations and referencing voodoo practices. But these films typically portrayed zombies as exotic threats that could be defeated by Western rationality and Christian faith, transforming complex spiritual traditions into simple entertainment formulas. The modern zombie, as we recognize it today, emerged primarily from the work of filmmaker George Romero, whose 1968 movie Night of the Living Dead reimagined zombies as infectious creatures whose condition spread through bites and whose primary motivation was the consumption of human flesh. Romero's zombies retained the mindless, shambling characteristics of earlier versions, but were stripped of any spiritual or religious context, becoming instead manifestations of social collapse and civilizational breakdown. This transformation reflected broader changes in how Western culture understood threats and anxieties during the Cold War period. Romero's zombies could be read as metaphors for conformity and social pressure, for the fear that individual identity might be subsumed by mass movements or collective hysteria. They represented the horror of losing one's essential humanity, not through supernatural curse, but through social and political processes that reduced people to mere functions within larger systems. The infectious nature of Romero's zombies also tapped into contemporary fears about disease, particularly in an era when the development of biological weapons and the threat of pandemic disease were becoming more visible in public consciousness. The idea that humanity could be transformed into something inhuman through exposure to contaminating influences reflected Cold War anxieties about ideological infection and cultural corruption. The gradual integration of zombies into Halloween celebrations occurred as these creatures evolved from serious religious beliefs to entertaining fictional monsters. The zombies' association with death and resurrection made them seasonally appropriate for Halloween's emphasis on supernatural themes, while their mindless nature made them less psychologically complex than vampires or werewolves, reducing the intellectual demands they placed on costume wearers and party participants. Zombie costumes for Halloween typically emphasize the creature's state of decay and mindlessness through torn clothing, simulated wounds, and vacant facial expressions. The shambling gait and groaning vocalizations associated with zombies are relatively easy to maintain throughout an evening of celebration, making them practical choices for extended Halloween events. The infectious nature of modern zombie mythology also creates opportunities for group costumes and coordinated activities that can enhance the social dimensions of Halloween celebrations. The transformation of zombies from victims of spiritual enslavement to infectious monsters reflects broader patterns in how Halloween creatures have been adapted from their original cultural contexts for use in contemporary celebrations. The process typically involves simplifying complex spiritual or psychological themes into more easily recognizable visual and behavioral characteristics, while preserving enough of the original mystery and threat to maintain the creature's effectiveness as a source of controlled fear. In educational contexts, the evolution of zombie mythology provides rich material for exploring themes related to cultural appropriation, the transformation of religious beliefs into entertainment, and the ways that different societies understand the relationship between individual identity and collective belonging. The contrast between traditional Caribbean zombie beliefs and modern Western zombie fiction illustrates how the same basic concept can carry very different meanings depending on its cultural context and social function. The therapeutic potential of zombie imagery has found expression in various contemporary contexts, from zombie walks that encourage community participation and physical exercise, to zombie-themed team-building exercises that explore group dynamics and collaborative problem-solving. The zombie's status as a being that has lost individual agency but retains basic functionality provides a metaphor for various psychological states and social conditions that people might want to explore in safe, playful contexts. In our current cultural moment, when questions about artificial intelligence, social media influence, and mass conformity are increasingly urgent, the zombie continues to serve as a powerful metaphor for the loss of individual autonomy and critical thinking. The shambling hordes of modern zombie fiction reflect contemporary fears about technological manipulation, social pressure, and the various ways that human consciousness might be compromised or controlled by forces beyond individual awareness or resistance. As Halloween night settles over neighborhoods where costumed figures move slowly through the darkness, some adopting the vacant stare and unsteady gait of the zombie, these creatures continue to carry their complex legacy of meaning. They remind us of the importance of maintaining individual autonomy and critical consciousness, of the dangers that can arise when social pressures overwhelm personal judgment, and of the various ways that human dignity can be threatened by forces that seek to reduce people to mere instruments for achieving external purposes. The zombie shuffling through October streets connects contemporary Halloween celebrations to traditions that are both much older and much more recent than most participants realize, carrying within its mindless gait echoes of African spiritual wisdom, Caribbean religious synthesis, and modern anxieties about collective identity and social control. In the gentle terror of Halloween night, the zombie finds its place among creatures that help us explore our deepest fears and fondest hopes about what it means to be human, in a world where humanity itself is constantly being redefined and challenged. On moonlit autumn roads that wind through the Hudson Valley, where mist rises from the river to blur the boundaries between earth and sky, where ancient Dutch farmhouses nestle among hills that have witnessed 3 centuries of American history, there rides a figure who has become one of our most distinctively American contributions to the Halloween pantheon. The headless horseman, spurring his black steed through the darkness in eternal pursuit of what he has lost, embodies the particular character of American Gothic imagination, transforming European folklore traditions into something uniquely suited to New World landscapes and concerns. The legend of the headless horseman emerged from the same cultural synthesis that created many of our most enduring American stories, blending European folk traditions with New World history, Old World supernatural beliefs with American landscape and experience. Washington Irving, who first gave literary form to this legend in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, understood that American literature needed to create its own mythology, its own collection of supernatural beings that could speak to distinctly American fears and fascinations. The figure of a headless rider was not original to Irving or to American folklore. Legends of decapitated horsemen appeared in various European traditions, often associated with battlefields where soldiers had lost their heads to cannonballs or sword strokes and were doomed to search eternally for what they had lost. These stories typically served as warnings about the consequences of violence, reminders that war's brutality could create spiritual disruptions that persisted long after the physical conflicts had ended. But Irving's genius lay in his adaptation of this archetypal figure to specifically American circumstances and concerns. His headless horseman was identified as a Hessian trooper, one of the German mercenaries who had fought for the British during the Revolutionary War, killed by a cannonball during a skirmish in the very region where his ghost now rode. This identification connected the supernatural story to actual American history, while suggesting that the violence that had given birth to the American nation continued to haunt the landscape where it had occurred. The choice of a Hessian soldier as the ghostly rider was particularly significant in the context of early American cultural development. These foreign mercenaries represented the Old World's attempt to suppress American independence, making them appropriate symbols of the past that America was trying to overcome while remaining bound to it in complex ways. The headless condition of the Hessian trooper suggested the confusion and disorientation that could result from violent displacement, the loss of identity and purpose that came with being severed from one's origins. The Hudson Valley setting that Irving chose for his story was perfectly suited to tales of supernatural persistence and historical haunting. This region had been the site of numerous Revolutionary War engagements, leaving it rich with stories of soldiers who had died far from home and might not rest quietly in unfamiliar soil. The valley's Dutch colonial heritage provided additional layers of cultural complexity, creating a landscape where different traditions and histories intersected in ways that seemed to invite supernatural manifestation. The autumn setting that became integral to the Headless Horseman legend reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. October was the time when the Revolutionary War skirmishes in the Hudson Valley had typically occurred, making it historically appropriate for ghostly reenactments of past conflicts. But autumn was also the season when the boundary between past and present seemed most permeable, when the dying of the year created an atmosphere conducive to encounters with spirits and memories. The harvest roads along which the horseman rode connected the supernatural story to the agricultural rhythms that dominated American life during Irving's time. These were the pathways that farmers used to transport their crops to market, the routes that connected isolated rural communities to the broader networks of commerce and communication. The appearance of a ghostly rider on these familiar roads suggested that the past could intrude upon the present in the most ordinary and expected places. The bridge that featured prominently in Irving's story served multiple symbolic functions that enhanced the legend's power and meaning. Bridges are traditional threshold locations in folklore, places where different realms meet and supernatural encounters become more likely. The specific bridge in Irving's tale, crossing the stream near the old Dutch church where the Hessian soldier was supposedly buried, created a geographical focus for the supernatural activity that made the story feel rooted in actual landscape rather than abstract imagination. The seasonal timing of the horseman's appearances, typically during the autumn months when nights grew longer and harvest activities brought people onto the roads after dark, aligned the supernatural story with natural rhythms and practical necessities. Unlike purely arbitrary supernatural encounters, the headless horseman's manifestations seemed to emerge organically from the landscape and the seasonal activities that brought people into contact with it. The horseman's eternal search for his missing head provided a poignant psychological dimension to what might otherwise have been simply a frightening ghost story. This quest suggested themes of incompleteness and disorientation that resonated with the American experience of cultural transplantation and identity formation. The immigrant experience of being severed from one's origins while struggling to establish identity in a new landscape found symbolic expression in the figure of the headless rider seeking what he had lost. The horse that carried the headless horseman through his nightly rides was as important to the legend as the rider himself. Black horses had long been associated with supernatural forces in European folklore, often serving as mounts for demons, witches, and other otherworldly beings. But in the American context, the horse also represented the freedom and mobility that characterized frontier life, the ability to traverse vast distances and escape the constraints of settled civilization. The partnership between the headless rider and his supernatural steed suggested a form of consciousness that transcended normal human limitations, a unity of purpose that could persist even when rational thought had been literally severed. This idea resonated with romantic notions about the relationship between human consciousness and natural forces, suggesting that some forms of connection to the landscape and its history operated below the level of rational awareness. The influence of Irving's Headless Horseman on American Halloween traditions developed gradually as the story spread beyond its original literary context to become part of popular folklore. The figure's association with autumn and supernatural activity made it a natural addition to Halloween celebrations, while its connection to American history gave it a patriotic dimension that distinguished it from imported European monsters. The horseman's visual iconography proved particularly well-suited to Halloween purposes. The dramatic image of a rider carrying his severed head under one arm while controlling his mount with the other created a striking costume possibility that was both distinctively American and universally recognizable. The combination of historical military dress with supernatural elements allowed costume wearers to embody both patriotic and spooky themes simultaneously. The Headless Horseman's integration into Halloween celebrations was also facilitated by the story's essential ambiguity about whether the supernatural encounters were genuine or manufactured. Irving's tale suggested that the horseman might actually be a local prankster named Brom Bones rather than an actual ghost, allowing Halloween participants to play with supernatural themes without committing to serious belief in paranormal phenomena. This ambiguity made the horseman particularly suitable for Halloween events that sought to balance thrilling supernatural elements with rational skepticism. Unlike monsters whose existence demanded complete suspension of disbelief, the headless horseman could be appreciated as either genuine supernatural entity or elaborate practical joke, allowing participants to engage with the story on whatever level felt most comfortable. The democratic character of the headless horseman legend also contributed to its popularity in American Halloween celebrations. Unlike vampires, who were typically aristocratic, or werewolves, who were often portrayed as exotic foreigners, the horseman was a soldier, a working-class figure whose supernatural condition resulted from the kind of military service that ordinary Americans might be called upon to perform. This made him a more accessible and relatable monster than creatures associated with European aristocracy or ancient mythology. Educational applications of the Headless Horseman story have found it valuable for teaching about American history, particularly the Revolutionary War period and the cultural development of the early United States. The legend provides a framework for discussing how historical events become transformed into folklore, how different cultural traditions blend to create new mythologies, and how supernatural stories can carry serious themes about national identity and cultural memory. The therapeutic potential of the headless horseman imagery has been explored in contexts related to trauma and displacement. The figure's condition of being severed from an essential part of himself while remaining driven by the compulsion to search for what has been lost provides a metaphor for various psychological states related to loss, disorientation, and the search for wholeness and identity. In contemporary American culture, the headless horseman continues to serve as a symbol of the ways that historical violence and trauma can persist in cultural memory, creating ongoing effects that influence present circumstances even when their origins are dimly understood. The figure reminds us that the past is never entirely past, that the violence and displacement involved in American national formation continue to shape contemporary experience in ways both obvious and subtle. As Halloween night descends over American landscapes, where history and legend intertwine like mist and moonlight, the headless horseman continues his eternal ride through our collective imagination. He represents the distinctively American contribution to the international community of Halloween monsters, a figure born from New World history and Old World imagination, carrying within his supernatural persistence both the trauma and the triumph of American cultural development. The sound of phantom hoofbeats echoing through October nights connects contemporary Halloween celebrations to the deeper rhythms of American history and identity, reminding us that some quests transcend individual lifetimes, some losses create searches that span generations, and some stories become powerful enough to reshape the very landscapes through which they move. In the gentle terror of Halloween night, the headless horseman finds his perfect home, a distinctively American monster celebrating in the shadows of a uniquely American holiday. In the shadowed corners of medieval imagination, where cathedral spires pierced the sky like prayers made stone, and monastery bells tolled the hours of prayer and contemplation, there lurked creatures of such malevolent intelligence and supernatural power that they came to represent the ultimate antithesis of divine love and human aspiration. These were the demons and devils of Christian mythology, beings who had once dwelt in the presence of God, but had chosen rebellion over obedience, knowledge over faith, pride over humility, creating through their fall a cosmic drama that would provide the theological framework for understanding evil and temptation in the Western world. The development of demonic imagery in Christian tradition drew upon multiple sources, synthesizing elements from Jewish apocalyptic literature, Greek and Roman mythology, Germanic and Celtic folklore, and the distinctive theological concerns of early Christian communities. The result was a complex hierarchy of evil beings, from the grand figure of Satan himself down to lesser demons who specialized in particular forms of temptation and torment, each designed to represent different aspects of the spiritual and moral challenges that confronted believers in a fallen world. The medieval period saw the flowering of demonic imagery in art, literature, and popular consciousness as Christian theologians worked to create systematic understandings of evil that could serve both doctrinal and pastoral purposes. The demons that emerged from this intellectual and artistic ferment were not mere monsters, but sophisticated adversaries, beings whose intelligence and supernatural abilities made them far more dangerous than any physical threat. Creatures who could tempt souls to damnation through subtle psychological manipulation and the exploitation of human weakness. The visual iconography that developed around demons and devils reflected both theological concerns and folkloric traditions, creating figures that were simultaneously terrifying and fascinating, repulsive and magnetic. The classic devil, with his horns and tail, his cloven hooves and pitchfork, his red skin and sardonic grin, combined elements from various sources including Pan and other nature deities from classical mythology, whose association with sexuality and wild behavior made them appropriate symbols for temptation and moral corruption. The horns that became standard demonic features served multiple symbolic functions. They referenced the ram and goat sacrifices of ancient religious practice, connecting demons to perverted forms of worship and ritual. They suggested bestial nature, the triumph of animal instinct over rational thought and moral restraint. They evoked images of power and aggression, the ability to gore and destroy those who opposed demonic will. Most importantly, they provided a visual contrast to the halos that surrounded holy figures, creating an immediate visual language for distinguishing between divine and infernal influences. The tail, another standard demonic feature, reinforced the association with bestial nature while also suggesting deception and cunning. The serpent's tail recalled the biblical account of the fall, when Satan, in the form of a serpent, tempted Eve to disobey God's command. The flexibility and mobility of a tails suggested the ability to move in unexpected ways, to strike from behind, to deceive and manipulate through indirect approaches that might not be immediately apparent to potential victims. The pitchfork or trident that demons typically carried served as both weapon and symbol of authority, suggesting their role as tormentors in hell, while also evoking agricultural implements that connected them to harvest imagery and seasonal festivals. The three-pronged fork specifically referenced the Trinity in a perverted form, representing demonic attempts to mock and corrupt divine truth through imitation and distortion. The red coloration associated with demons served multiple symbolic purposes, evoking blood and violence, fire and damnation, passion and uncontrolled desire. Red was the color of warning and danger, of stop signs and emergency signals, making it an appropriate choice for beings whose presence signaled spiritual peril. But red was also the color of life and vitality, of roses and wine, suggesting that demonic temptation often came disguised as attractive and desirable experiences rather than obviously threatening ones. The intelligence attributed to demons in medieval theology made them particularly complex and troubling adversaries. Unlike mindless monsters who could be defeated through physical strength or simple avoidance, demons possessed supernatural knowledge and psychological insight that allowed them to tailor their temptations to individual weaknesses and circumstances. They could quote scripture when it served their purposes, could appear as angels of light to deceive the unwary, could offer genuine rewards and benefits as inducements to spiritual compromise. This intellectual dimension of demonic nature created ongoing tension in Christian thought between the need to take demonic threats seriously and the danger of becoming overly fascinated with evil. The detailed demonologies that medieval scholars developed, with their elaborate classifications of different types of demons and their specific areas of influence, reflected both genuine theological concern and a possibly unhealthy fascination with the very forces they claimed to oppose. The seasonal associations that connected demons and devils to autumn and Halloween developed through multiple cultural pathways. The harvest festivals that preceded Halloween had long included elements designed to ward off evil influences that might threaten crops or livestock during the vulnerable transition from autumn to winter. The Celtic traditions that gave rise to Halloween included beliefs about malevolent spirits that might cross over from the other world during times when the boundary between realms grew thin. The Christian transformation of these seasonal observances involved reinterpreting pagan spirits as demons while preserving many of the protective rituals and warning practices that had previously been directed toward older supernatural threats. All Hallows' Eve became a time when demonic forces were believed to be particularly active, requiring heightened vigilance and spiritual protection from believers who might encounter supernatural temptation or assault. The folk traditions that developed around Halloween included numerous practices designed to protect against demonic influence, from the carving of jack-o'-lanterns whose lights could frighten away evil spirits, to the wearing of costumes that might confuse demons about the identity and nature of potential victims. These practices reflected the understanding that Halloween was a time of particular spiritual danger, when ordinary protective barriers might be weakened and supernatural threats might be more common and powerful than usual. The gradual secularization of Halloween transformed demons and devils from serious theological threats to entertaining costume choices, reflecting broader changes in how Western culture understood supernatural phenomena and moral authority. As scientific explanations for natural events became more widely accepted and religious authority became less central to social organization, demonic imagery migrated from the realm of serious belief to the realm of cultural symbolism and playful entertainment. This transformation was facilitated by the theatrical traditions that had long surrounded demonic imagery. From medieval mystery plays that featured devils as comic relief to more sophisticated dramatic works that explored the psychological complexity of temptation and moral choice. The stage devil, with his exaggerated features and melodramatic behavior, provided a template for the Halloween devil that emphasized entertainment value over genuine spiritual threat. The democratization of demonic imagery through Halloween celebrations also reflected changing attitudes toward authority and rebellion in modern democratic societies. The devil, who had once represented ultimate evil and cosmic threat, became a symbol of harmless mischief and playful transgression, allowing participants to experiment with themes of rebellion and rule-breaking in contexts that posed no genuine challenge to social order or personal morality. Children's devil costumes typically emphasized the playful rather than threatening aspects of demonic imagery, featuring bright red clothing, plastic horns and pitchforks, and friendly facial expressions that transformed terrifying theological concepts into harmless, dress-up fun. These costumes allowed young people to explore themes of power and transgression while remaining safely within the bounds of acceptable behavior and community standards. Adult devil costumes often played with more sophisticated aspects of demonic symbolism, exploring themes of temptation, seduction, and moral ambiguity in ways that could be both entertaining and thought-provoking. The sexy devil costume, in particular, drew upon traditions that associated demons with sexual temptation, while adapting these themes for contemporary celebrations that valued playfulness over serious moral instruction. The educational applications of demonic imagery have found it valuable for teaching about medieval history, religious development, and the role of mythology in shaping cultural values and social behavior. The study of how demonic concepts developed and changed over time provides insights into broader patterns of cultural evolution and the ways that societies use supernatural beliefs to address practical concerns about social order and individual behavior. The therapeutic potential of demonic imagery has been explored in contexts related to shadow work and the integration of rejected aspects of personality and experience. The devil, as a symbol of repressed or forbidden impulses, can provide a framework for exploring psychological material that might be difficult to approach through more direct means, allowing individuals to examine their own capacity for transgression and moral choice in safe, symbolic contexts. In contemporary culture, demons and devils continue to serve as symbols for various forms of temptation and moral challenge, from the marketing techniques that encourage consumer excess to the political rhetoric that appeals to humanity's worst impulses rather than its highest aspirations. The figure of the devil reminds us that evil often comes disguised as good, that the most dangerous temptations are often those that offer genuine benefits, along with hidden costs. As Halloween night settles over communities where costumed figures move through streets lit by jack-o'-lanterns and porch lights, where children carrying bags of candy encounter neighbors offering treats. The presence of demons and devils among the celebrating crowds serves as a gentle reminder of older concerns and deeper questions about the nature of good and evil, temptation and choice, rebellion and responsibility. The little devil with plastic horns and a store-bought pitchfork, the teenager dressed in a red outfit with a pointed tail, the adult whose costume plays with themes of temptation and transgression, all participate in a tradition that transforms ancient fears into contemporary fun, while preserving something essential about the human experience of moral choice and spiritual challenge. In the warm glow of Halloween celebration, demons and devils find their place among creatures that help us explore our relationship to the darker aspects of human nature and supernatural possibility. They remind us that every choice involves the potential for both good and evil, that the most attractive options are not always the wisest ones, and that the capacity for moral reasoning brings with it the ongoing responsibility to choose well, even when the consequences of our choices remain unclear. The gentle terror of Halloween night provides the perfect context for encountering these ancient symbols of moral complexity, allowing us to acknowledge the reality of temptation and the possibility of corruption while celebrating our capacity to choose community over selfishness, generosity over greed, love over fear. In this balance between acknowledgement and affirmation, demons and devils serve their contemporary function as reminders that even in our celebration of the supernatural and the transgressive, we remain committed to the values and relationships that make celebration itself possible. In the amber glow of early cinema, when silent films flickered across silver screens in darkened theaters, and audiences gasped at moving images that seemed to bring impossible dreams to life, a new kind of magic was born. This was the magic of the moving picture, and it would transform our Halloween monsters from creatures of folklore and literature into icons of popular culture, giving them faces and voices that would become more familiar to most people than any written description could ever be. The early film industry discovered almost immediately that audiences had an insatiable appetite for stories that thrilled and frightened, that transported them safely into realms of supernatural terror and otherworldly adventure. The monsters that had previously lived only in the imagination of writers or the memory of storytellers could now be made visible, given physical form through the artistry of makeup and special effects, through the performances of actors who understood how to embody archetypal fears and fascinations. The German expressionist films of the 1920s established many of the visual conventions that would define movie monsters for decades to come. Movies like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu used stark lighting, distorted sets, and exaggerated makeup to create atmospheres of psychological unease and supernatural dread that translated remarkably well from European folklore to cinematic imagery. These films demonstrated that the camera could capture not just the external appearance of monsters, but their essential atmosphere, their capacity to transform familiar environments into landscapes of fear and wonder. The arrival of sound technology in the late 1920s added new dimensions to monster movies, allowing filmmakers to explore the vocal characteristics that could make supernatural creatures seem more real and threatening. The electronic hum that accompanied Frankenstein's monster, The eerie silence of the vampire, the anguished howl of the werewolf, all became part of the audio signature that helped define these creatures for movie audiences who might never read the original stories from which they were adapted. But it was the Universal Studios monster films of the 1930s and 1940s that truly established the visual iconography we associate with Halloween monsters today. Boris Karloff's Frankenstein monster, with his flat-topped head and neck bolts, Bela Lugosi's Dracula, with his dramatic cape and hypnotic stare, Lon Chaney Jr.'s Wolfman, with his tortured expression and abundant facial hair, all became the definitive versions of these characters for generations of viewers who encountered them first through movies rather than literature. These cinematic interpretations served multiple cultural functions beyond simple entertainment. They democratized monster stories, making them accessible to audiences regardless of education or literacy level. They standardized monster imagery, creating shared visual references that could be recognized across cultural and linguistic boundaries. They domesticated supernatural fears, transforming genuine terror into manageable entertainment that could be enjoyed in the safe social context of movie theaters. The Universal monster movies also established the template for treating supernatural creatures as tragic figures rather than simple villains, beings who deserved sympathy as much as fear. This approach, which drew upon romantic literary traditions but translated them into popular entertainment, made these monsters more suitable for family Halloween celebrations, where genuine terror would be inappropriate, but playful spookiness was desired. The rise of television in the 1950s created new opportunities for monster imagery to enter American homes and become part of daily cultural experience. Horror hosts like Vampira and later Elvira presented classic monster movies in contexts that emphasized entertainment over genuine fright, often adding comedic commentary that further domesticated supernatural imagery for family consumption. These presentations taught viewers how to approach monster imagery as fun rather than frightening, as material for play rather than serious supernatural concern. Television also created new forms of monster entertainment specifically designed for younger audiences. Shows like The Munsters and The Addams Family presented supernatural creatures as sitcom characters, beings whose monstrous nature was primarily a source of gentle humor rather than genuine threat. These programs demonstrated how completely Halloween monsters had been integrated into mainstream American culture, becoming familiar enough to serve as the basis for family comedy rather than supernatural terror. The 1960s marked the beginning of mass-produced Halloween costumes and decorations that brought movie monster imagery directly into American homes and Halloween celebrations. Children could now dress as specific movie monsters rather than generic ghosts or witches, while homeowners could decorate their properties with imagery drawn directly from popular films. This commercialization of monster imagery reflected its complete transformation from folklore to consumer product, from genuine supernatural belief to manufactured entertainment. The latex masks and plastic accessories that became standard elements of Halloween celebration allowed ordinary people to transform themselves into recognizable movie monsters with relatively little effort or expense. The Frankenstein mask, the vampire fangs, the werewolf gloves with attached claws, all enabled participants to embody specific characters rather than general supernatural types, creating more elaborate and recognizable costume possibilities. The development of color television and improved special effects technology in the 1970s and 1980s created new possibilities for monster imagery that was both more realistic and more spectacular than earlier black-and-white presentations. Movies like The Exorcist and An American Werewolf in London demonstrated how modern technology could create supernatural effects that were far more convincing than anything previously possible, while television specials like The Nightmare Before Christmas showed how monster imagery could be adapted for musical and comedic purposes. The emergence of cable television and home video technology made monster movies more accessible than ever before, allowing viewers to watch classic horror films whenever they chose, rather than waiting for special Halloween broadcasts. This accessibility further normalized monster imagery, making it a regular part of popular culture rather than a seasonal specialty, while also creating markets for new monster movies and television shows that could be viewed year-round. The rise of the internet and social media has created unprecedented opportunities for sharing and creating monster imagery. From elaborate Halloween costume tutorials on YouTube to Instagram accounts dedicated to vintage horror movie memorabilia. These platforms have enabled the development of communities organized around shared interests in monster culture, creating spaces where fans can share knowledge, creativity, and enthusiasm for supernatural imagery and storytelling. The globalization of American popular culture through movies, television, and internet media has spread Halloween monster imagery far beyond its original cultural contexts, making figures like Frankenstein's monster and Dracula recognizable worldwide, even in cultures that have very different traditional approaches to supernatural beings and seasonal celebrations. This cultural export has sometimes led to interesting hybrid celebrations that combine American Halloween imagery with local traditions and customs. The educational applications of movie monster imagery have found it valuable for teaching about film history, special effects technology, and the relationship between popular culture and traditional folklore. The study of how literary monsters were adapted for cinematic presentation provides insights into broader patterns of cultural adaptation and the ways that new technologies can transform traditional narratives and symbols. The therapeutic potential of monster imagery has been explored in various contexts, from art therapy programs that use monster creation as a way of exploring and expressing difficult emotions to social skills, training that uses monster movies as a framework for discussing themes of acceptance, difference, and social integration. The monsters' status as outsiders who struggle to find acceptance in human society provides metaphors for various forms of social alienation and personal difference. Contemporary Halloween celebrations continue to be heavily influenced by movie and television monster imagery, with costume choices often reflecting current popular films and shows rather than traditional folklore. The annual release of new horror movies provides fresh inspiration for Halloween costumes and decorations, while classic monster imagery maintains its appeal for those who prefer traditional approaches to Halloween celebration. The merchandising that surrounds monster movies has created an entire industry of Halloween-related products, from elaborate animatronic decorations that recreate movie special effects to high-end replica costumes that allow fans to embody their favorite characters with museum-quality accuracy. This commercialization has made monster imagery more accessible while also raising questions about the relationship between authentic folklore and manufactured entertainment. As digital technology continues to advance, creating new possibilities for special effects and virtual reality experiences, the future of monster imagery seems likely to involve even more immersive and interactive forms of supernatural entertainment. Virtual reality horror experiences and augmented reality Halloween displays represent new frontiers in the ongoing evolution of how we encounter and interact with supernatural imagery. The influence of cinema and popular culture on Halloween monster imagery reflects broader patterns in how traditional beliefs and practices adapt to modern technologies and social structures. The monsters that once emerged from genuine fear and supernatural belief have been transformed into characters in ongoing cultural narratives, symbols that continue to evolve as they encounter new media and new generations of interpreters. On Halloween night, as jack-o'-lanterns glow with electric lights and costumed figures move through neighborhoods where every house displays decorations inspired by decades of movie imagery, we see the culmination of this transformation from folklore to popular culture. The monsters walking these streets carry with them not just the ancient fears that gave them birth, but the accumulated imagery of a century of filmmaking, the shared cultural references that connect strangers through recognition of familiar characters and symbols. The child dressed as a movie vampire, the teenager wearing a latex werewolf mask, the adult whose Frankenstein costume recreates Boris Karloff's iconic appearance, all participate in a celebration that bridges traditional folklore and contemporary entertainment, ancient fears and modern fun. They embody the remarkable cultural journey that has transformed supernatural threats into beloved characters, genuine terror into gentle play, isolated folk beliefs into shared cultural celebration. In the warm glow of porch lights and the friendly bustle of trick-or-treat activities, movie monsters find their perfect home among Halloween traditions that value entertainment over fear, community over isolation, shared fun over individual terror. They remind us that even our scariest stories can be transformed into sources of joy and connection, that the human imagination is powerful enough to take our deepest fears and make them into our most cherished celebrations. In the gentle darkness of an October evening, when the last light fades from western skies and the first stars appear between the branches of bare trees, we find ourselves once again in the presence of our Halloween monsters, these familiar figures who have traveled such long journeys to reach our modern celebrations. They stand before us now, not as the terrifying forces they once were, but as gentle companions in our seasonal ritual of transformation and play. Teachers who help us explore the mysterious territories that lie between fear and fun, between the known and the unknown. These creatures carry within themselves the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the distilled experience of countless generations who have struggled to understand the mysteries of life and death, good and evil, civilization and wildness. The witch who once brewed healing potions in her cottage garden now helps us explore questions about knowledge and power, about the difference between wisdom and mere information, about the importance of respecting forces that we cannot fully control or understand. The ghost who drifts through our Halloween celebrations carries with it all the love that refuses to accept the finality of death, all the memories that insist on persistence beyond the grave, all the hope that something essential about human consciousness survives the dissolution of the body. In its translucent presence, we find comfort for our own fears of mortality and reassurance that the bonds we form with others create connections stronger than any physical limitation. The vampire who appears at our Halloween parties embodies our complex relationship with desire and power, our fascination with beings who have transcended ordinary human limitations while paying terrible prices for their transformation. In its eternal hunger, we recognize our own struggles with appetites that can never be fully satisfied, longings that persist no matter how much we consume or acquire. The werewolf padding through our October nights reminds us that civilization is always a fragile achievement, that beneath our carefully constructed social personas lie instincts and energies that connect us to our animal heritage. In its monthly transformation, we see reflected our own capacity for change, our potential for both creation and destruction, our need to integrate rather than simply suppress the wilder aspects of our nature. The mummy shuffling gently through our Halloween celebrations speaks to our desire for continuity and preservation, our hope that something important about human experience can survive the passage of time, and the changes that sweep away familiar landmarks. In its careful wrapping, we see our own attempts to protect what we value most from the erosive effects of time and circumstance. Frankenstein's monster, wandering through our neighborhood celebrations with bolted neck and gentle demeanor, embodies our ongoing questions about creation and responsibility, about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, about what we owe to our creations and what they owe to us. In its artificial nature, we confront our own role as shapers of the world we inhabit and the beings we become. The zombie, moving slowly through our Halloween festivities, carries warnings about the importance of individual consciousness and social responsibility, about the dangers that arise when we surrender our capacity for independent thought and moral judgment. In its mindless persistence, we see reflections of our own vulnerability to forces that would reduce us to mere instruments for achieving external purposes. The headless horseman galloping through our imagination represents the distinctively American contribution to this community of monsters, a figure born from New World history and Old World folklore who reminds us that every nation creates its own ghost stories, its own ways of understanding how the past continues to influence the present. In its eternal search, we recognize our own ongoing quest for identity and wholeness, our need to understand where we came from in order to know where we are going. Even the demons and devils who appear at our Halloween celebrations, transformed from theological threats into playful symbols, continue to serve important functions in helping us explore questions about temptation and moral choice, about the difference between harmless mischief and genuine corruption, about the ongoing human responsibility to choose well even when the consequences of our choices remain unclear. These monsters comfort us precisely because they have been transformed from sources of genuine terror into opportunities for safe exploration of themes and experiences that might otherwise be too frightening or overwhelming to contemplate directly. They provide frameworks for discussing death without despair, power without abuse, change without chaos, mystery without madness. They offer us ways of acknowledging the reality of fear while affirming our capacity to transform even our scariest experiences into sources of connection and joy. The process by which these creatures have been domesticated for Halloween celebration reflects something essential about human resilience and creativity. We have taken our deepest fears and most troubling anxieties and transformed them into occasions for community gathering, family fun, and shared storytelling. We have discovered that even the most frightening experiences can be made manageable through the alchemy of art and imagination, through the magic of collective celebration and mutual support. This transformation serves important psychological and social functions that extend far beyond mere entertainment. Halloween monsters provide safe ways for children to explore concepts of death and danger, difference and otherness, without being overwhelmed by the genuine complexity and difficulty of these experiences. They offer adults opportunities to reconnect with their own capacity for wonder and imagination, to remember that the world contains more mystery than any rational system can fully explain or control. Most importantly, Halloween monsters create opportunities for communities to come together in celebration of shared human experiences that transcend individual differences of background, belief, and circumstance. When children from different families dress as vampires and witches, when neighbors decorate their homes with images of ghosts and goblins, when adults gather to share stories of supernatural encounters, both real and imagined, they participate in rituals that strengthen social bonds while honoring the mysterious dimensions of human experience. The masks that we wear on Halloween night, the costumes that transform us temporarily into other beings, serve functions that anthropologists have recognized in ritual practices throughout human history. They allow us to step outside our ordinary identities and social roles, to experiment with different ways of being in the world, to explore aspects of ourselves that might otherwise remain hidden or suppressed. The monster mask creates a temporary freedom from the constraints of everyday personality and social expectation. But perhaps most significantly, Halloween monsters teach us that fear itself can be transformed, that the experiences we find most threatening can become sources of strength and wisdom if we approach them with the right kind of courage and community support. The child who learns to laugh at a vampire costume has taken an important step toward understanding that many of our fears lose their power when we face them directly and honestly. The adult who chooses to dress as a witch or werewolf affirms their confidence that they can embody even frightening imagery without being overwhelmed or corrupted by it. This lesson extends far beyond Halloween celebrations to encompass broader questions about how we face the genuine challenges and uncertainties that characterize human life. The monsters who comfort us on Halloween night remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act constructively even when we are afraid. that wisdom involves not the elimination of mystery, but the development of skills for navigating uncertainty with grace and creativity. The traditions that surround Halloween monsters also preserve important cultural knowledge about the role of storytelling in human life, about the ways that narratives shape our understanding of ourselves and our world. These stories connect us to centuries of human experience, to the accumulated wisdom of generations who have faced similar challenges and found ways to transform their struggles into sources of meaning and hope. As we watch children move through autumn darkness in their monster costumes, as we see adults gathered around fires sharing tales of supernatural encounters, as we participate in the gentle rituals that connect us to both ancient traditions and contemporary community, we witness the continued vitality of humanity's most enduring characteristics. We see our capacity for transformation, our ability to create beauty from terror, our skill at building connections that transcend individual limitation and circumstance. The monsters who walk with us through Halloween night carry within themselves all the fears and hopes, all the wisdom and wonder, all the love and longing that have characterized human experience since our ancestors first gathered around fires to share stories about the mysterious forces that shaped their world. They remind us that we are part of a tradition that extends far beyond our individual lives, that connects us to both the past that gave us birth and the future that we are helping to create. As the final jack-o'-lantern dims and the last costumed figure disappears into the warmth of home, as the October night settles into the quiet that precedes November dawn, our Halloween monsters return to their dwelling places in imagination and memory, in story and dream, in the spaces between heartbeats where mystery makes its home. They will rest there through the turning seasons, gathering strength for their next emergence, preserving the ancient wisdom that helps us remember who we are and who we might become. The old stories find their rest now. The gentle monsters return to shadow, and the night grows still around us, like a blanket woven from starlight and memory. Let them keep their watch at the threshold of sleep, these guardians of the in-between, these teachers of transformation. Rest now, and dream well, knowing that some companions never truly leave us, some stories never end, and some forms of magic are as eternal as the human heart that beats with wonder in the darkness. Good night.